All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergate. This day, December 15th, 1960, 73-year-old retired postal worker Richard Paul Pavlik is arrested for a plot to assassinate President-elect John F. Kennedy. Kennedy had just been elected in that year's election. On December 11th, in Palm Beach, Pavlik lined his car with dynamite and parked outside of Kennedy's compound waiting for him to leave for Sunday Mass. His plot was to ram his car into JFK's limo as the president to be left his home, killing everyone inside. The plan did not pan out, as we know, and as we'll discuss in a minute. But this was, of course, just under 3 years before Kennedy would be assassinated in Dallas. So let's talk about the would-be assassination of JFK and lots more about this transition era going into the 60s. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Lots of interesting details in this plot and this would-be assassin. Why don't we start big, though? I was going to say, why would someone want to kill Kennedy at this point? But, I think we'll get into some of the things that are going on in Pavlik's mind. But in a larger sense, does this story help us maybe reframe that, like, not everyone loved JFK when he first came into office, which I think is part of the sort of Camelot myth that a lot of us have in our heads? Is there some bigger lesson or reminder there?
JFK was an enormously divisive candidate. First of all, he and Richard Nixon, who ran against one another in the 1960 election, the vote was separated by a hair's breadth. So it could have gone either way. There were definitely questions about how that election played out. There were people who doubted the legitimacy of the results. But also, and most importantly, Kennedy was a Catholic. There had never been a Catholic president before. Like, my grandma and grandpa were ecstatic that he was elected because it meant that a Catholic could become president. And that was a kind of moment of inclusion for Catholics in the United States. But for folks who were anti-Catholic, it was the beginning of the overtaking of the U.S. by the Pope in Rome. And there was something that they were pretty fearful of there.
Yeah, I don't think people realize just the sentiment towards anti-Catholicism. Like in the 1920s, the number one motivation for joining the Ku Klux Klan was anti-Catholicism. Like that was what got people rallied together. And so not that much longer later, those sentiments are still there. The distrust is still there about where his allegiance really is. And so so there are a lot of reasons that people were upset with Kennedy, and unfortunately a lot of reasons why people would want to take him out.
And to layer another thing on top of this, he was also a Democrat. And there was a growing right-wing anti-communist movement in the United States that saw Kennedy as a threat, not just as a Catholic, but as a liberal, as a closet communist. And so you look at a place like Dallas, as Ted Miller wrote in Nut Country, where there really was this outrage at the fact that Kennedy was president because it was seen as kind of a loss in the Cold War for folks who were pretty far to the right.
It's funny. We just did those episodes with our researcher Jacob about some of the main themes that we've covered over 400 or so, and I don't think we talked about anti-Catholicism as this through line, but certainly for episodes we've probably done like an episode every decade for like 200 years, that where the answer or the heart of it all is largely like anti-Catholic sentiment. And then, to your point, Niki, marry that with, I think, something else that I've learned about and sort of we fleshed out in our conversations, the sort of deep paranoia around the Cold War. And conspiracy-mindedness rising in the 50s. And so thinking of Kennedy's entrance as a sort of product of hundreds of years of those two those two streams coming together really does, I think, recast some of the understanding of Camelot and how he comes into office. This would-be assassin, Pavlik, is from New Hampshire. He is, I think, has a reputation as a grumpy old man who rants and raves and has some things going on. But he also did focus a lot of his anger on Catholics and the Kennedys in particular as elitist and, wealthy family. And so like some of these larger strains were flowing through what was clearly a, kind of troubled guy.
Yes, the intermixing of mental illness and anti-religious bigotry will not be unfamiliar to listeners today, but he had been known as somebody who was kind of a crank. He would write these crazy postcards, and at some point after Kennedy's election, he gives his little house away to a nearby camp, and he packs up all of his bags, gets in his car, and he disappears. And that's kind of the starting point for this conflict that will make its way to Kennedy's house.
So the crazy thing about it is that he's sending these postcards, and the postmaster notices that he's sending these postcards to every single location that John F. Kennedy has been at. So he's really concerned that, like, okay, this is a guy that's really trailing the president and wants to probably commit some kind of violent act. And so it was enough for him to really turn it into the police and say, maybe you can make sense of these dots.
Which is a remarkable story. The idea that the postmaster, who, let's be fair, should not have been reading this man's postcards, but was reading his postcards. But the idea that he would notice that, oh, this is coming from a place where the president-to-be just was. This is coming from somewhere near where I know the president-to-be lives. And he's saying things like that the town was going to hear from him soon in a big way, was enough to take his concerns to the police, who takes them to the Secret Service.
This is more than just a remarkable thing. This is like the greatest scene in the like beginning of the second act of a movie. Like he could literally be like, you could see him, right? Hunched over with the postcards laid out in front of him, and he starts to put it together.
The
like that scene
board.
And then there's the bulletin board and the map, and he's popping them up on the map, and he's putting up the postcards on the map, and then he's putting press clippings that say President Kennedy was in Palm Beach, President Kennedy was in Wilmington. He's putting it together, and you get this montage, and then there may be this string coming out, and it's putting together,
some
it's dark, and then he pulls his glasses off as he realizes the whole pattern come together. And the postmaster is the hero here, alerts it is incredible. And it's
we
like
just
almost
gave someone the script. Here you
I
go.
know. But it's it's always nice to have a postmaster as a hero, I suppose. But he calls local police, they call Secret Service. His plan is unraveled, but really actually not. Like, the Secret Service does get after Pavlik, but only after this attempt, which is what we're here to talk about today. So Pavlik doesn't get busted in advance of this attempt. He actually is about to do this thing and doesn't. So what goes on that day where he loads his car with dynamite and is going to try and assassinate Kennedy in Florida?
I mean, part of the point of the assassination was to kill just Kennedy. He wasn't really trying to harm anyone else. But on the day in which he's plotting this violence, he realizes that Kennedy's not alone. He's in the car with his wife and their children, their newborn, who's only about a month old. And he realizes he can't go through it. He's not trying to kill the whole family. He just wants to get Kennedy. And it's for that reason that sort of, I don't know if you would call it a sentimental reason, but certainly he makes this moral calculation about how this should go down, and he's not interested in killing the rest of his family.
Which is also kind of a remarkably cinematic moment. Here he is driving a car that is lined with dynamite. So he has made a decision that his life is also going to end.
Yeah.
And God, it could end any moment if like somebody drives into him, T-bones him when he's driving around the city. But he's sitting out there waiting and watching the Kennedys. And they have this like bucolic scene of a young family coming out to go to church. So in their Sunday best, and that changes his mind. And again, like, history doesn't always have this cinematic quality. It's often far messier than this, but he ultimately doesn't do it, and then the Secret Service are able to track him down and arrest him before he has a chance to do it again.
So he gets arrested, and he says something that really sort of like states his whole motivation for his resentment. He says that Kennedy's money bought the White House, he bought the presidency, and that he wanted to stop Kennedy from being president. He's very clear about what he wanted to do. And, you know, who knows if had he been given the opportunity, he seems really committed to following through.
And ultimately, he's put on trial, but it becomes very clear as they are building up to this trial that he is not somebody who is capable at that point of telling the difference between right and wrong. And if you don't pass that test, then you're non compos mentis, and so you can't be tried. So he ends up locked up. He ends up taken off the streets, but he's held in a mental institution and not a prison.
Yeah. By the way, the day that he gets arrested and the day this shows up in the papers, it is buried by other news, which is this incident that I'm familiar with, and we haven't done on the show, but it's this incident, this mid-air collision on December 16th, 1960, over New York, and it's referred to as the Park Slope air disaster, and 138 people, I believe, die in it. But do you know about this? Have you ever seen photos? There's photos of like the half of an airliner jet like plopped down in the middle of Park Slope, Brooklyn, after this air disaster over New York. So I just happened to notice like that's the same day that he gets arrested, and that's obviously the big news. It's crazy. You should go look at photos of that.
I will. Wow.
And so it gets a little buried. I mean, you know, obviously it's an assassination attempt, and there's a trial and so forth. So it gets some coverage, but it is an interesting sort of coincidence on that specific day. He goes to jail for a while, and of course, a few years later, Kennedy is assassinated. One other little note of history is that the charges are eventually dropped on December 2nd, 1963, 10 days after Kennedy's assassination in Dallas.
So charges aren't dropped because Kennedy's dead.
That's right. They're dropped because they've determined there's no way he can have a fair trial because he can't understand right and wrong. Right.
Wow.
He is ultimately released 3 years later in 1966 after this long campaign by Bill Loeb, who was the head of the Manchester Union Leader, which was this right-leaning newspaper in New Hampshire, which had run a number of extremely anti-Kennedy pieces, as you can imagine, as a conservative newspaper. But yeah, he eventually
Bill
makes
Loeb,
his way
like
out.
New Hampshire kingmaker, right, for conservatives and very influential and so forth. So yeah, there we go. And he eventually dies. Pavlik dies in 1975. And gosh, I think this story is not really told very much in terms of the story of JFK. But again, to another just reminder, I know this is like a very basic, but the fact that Kennedy was killed 3 years, I mean, that Kennedy was only president for 3 years is just one of those simple facts that I just have to remind myself of. And it's just kind of remarkable. And this helps us sort of realize that timetable.
Yeah. I also think that because Kennedy is so beloved because of his assassination, there's this whole nostalgia that gets heightened because of that. I also think there's a tendency to forget about it because we're so fixed on the assassination itself that anything that comes before that doesn't get much traction.
Yeah. Because he wasn't this glowingly popular president in those 3 years in office. He had a lot of big failures while in office, but again, the legend of Camelot would take over in the end.
Yeah. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.